volunteers are using these shells to build reefs that will help new oysters grow in low-country waterways.
In 2007, Florida took 500,000 tons of discarded restaurant oyster shells and dumped them straight into the Gulf of Mexico near Cedar Key. To many people, the project looked completely absurd. Fishermen feared it would damage their livelihoods. Conservationists warned it could suffocate the sea floor. Some even called it nothing more than ocean dumping with a conservation label. But while the debate continued above the water, the Gulf's sea floor had already started transforming at a speed no one thought possible. Just 18 months after the shells were dumped, a stretch of dead ocean bottom had come back to life, with oysters growing far more densely than scientists had ever predicted. But this wasn't just the return of a reef. It was the beginning of a self-sustaining ecosystem that's still growing today. So, how did a pile of restaurant waste create one of the world's most successful ecosystem restoration projects? Let's understand this whole story. Why scientists took the risk. For centuries, oyster reefs were one of the most important ecosystems along Florida's Gulf Coast. In places like Apalachicola Bay, oysters supported a major commercial fishing industry, with thousands of people depending on the bay's oyster harvest for their livelihoods. But by the early 2000s, many of those reefs were collapsing. Years of overharvesting, pollution, coastal development, and agricultural runoff had pushed the ecosystem to a breaking point. Diseases like dermo, which slowly destroy oyster tissue, spread rapidly. Predators multiplied, and reefs that had taken centuries to build began disappearing within just a few years. And this wasn't just an oyster problem. Oyster reefs are often called ecosystem engineers because they create homes for hundreds of other species. Their rough, interlocking shells form a maze where young fish, blue crabs, stone crabs, shrimp, and countless other animals can hide while they grow. Scientists estimate that a single healthy reef can support around 300 different species. As those reefs disappeared, fish nurseries vanished, crab populations declined, the water turned murkier, and the entire coastal ecosystem began falling apart. For years, Florida watched this slow collapse of its oyster reefs with no practical way to stop it. Then, in 2007, the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, or FWC, launched an ambitious restoration project near Cedar Key on Florida's Gulf Coast. And it wasn't a random location. Cedar Key has some of the best natural conditions for oyster reefs. But years of drought pushed salt levels too high, killing off one of the area's largest reefs. That left behind another problem. Young oysters can't grow on soft mud. They need a hard surface to attach themselves to. Without it, the reef couldn't rebuild naturally. So the FWC decided to create that missing foundation. But they didn't use concrete, steel, or expensive artificial reefs. They used discarded oyster shells. Instead of letting restaurants and seafood companies send millions of shells to landfills, the FWC collected them. But before they could be returned to the Gulf, the shells had to be cured under the hot sun for 3 to 6 months. This removed any leftover oyster tissue, bacteria, and parasites. Once ready, the shells were loaded onto barges and placed at carefully selected restoration sites offshore. Between 2007 and 2024, more than 500,000 tons of oyster shells were returned to the Gulf, roughly the weight of 1,300 Boeing 747s. It was one of the largest oyster restoration projects Florida had ever attempted. But not everyone thought it was a good idea. Environmental groups feared hundreds of thousands of tons of shells would bury fragile organisms already living on the seafloor. Commercial fishermen had their own concerns. They warned the jagged shell beds could tear apart shrimp nets worth thousands of dollars and stir up sediment that could damage nearby fishing grounds. Even many scientists weren't convinced. Artificial reef projects usually took years, sometimes even decades, to show real results. Others never got that far because Gulf storms and shifting currents scattered them before they could become living reefs. To many critics, this looked like a multi-million-dollar gamble that was about to fail in full public view. So when scientists returned to inspect the site, they weren't looking for success. They were expecting to document a costly mistake. But what they found beneath those shells was something that had already begun rebuilding the reef, far faster than anyone thought possible. The invisible takeover. The first life to arrive wasn't oysters, it was something almost impossible to see. Within just a day or two of reaching the seafloor, every oyster shell was covered by billions of microscopic bacteria. These tiny organisms were the first to claim the empty surface. They didn't arrive by accident. Ocean currents carried them in almost immediately, and once they landed, they got to work. Instead of simply sitting there, the bacteria began producing a thin, sticky layer called a biofilm. Think of it as a living coating, a microscopic glue made from natural sugars and proteins. It covered the rough shell surface, trapped nutrients drifting through the water, and created a stable place where other tiny organisms could survive. Then, the shells started helping too. Oyster shells are made mostly of calcium carbonate, including a mineral called aragonite. As seawater slowly dissolved tiny amounts of that mineral, it released calcium into the surrounding water and made the area just a little less acidic. It was a tiny chemical change, but it sent a powerful signal. Many tiny marine larvae can actually detect those chemical changes. To them, it was like a green light, a signal that this was a safe place to settle and begin building their own hard shells. Barnacles were among the first to arrive, followed by tube worms that cemented themselves directly onto the growing reef. Soon, microscopic algae covered the biofilm, creating the first layer of a new food web. Tiny crustaceans and worm larvae moved in to feed on it. Then came young fish and shrimp, drawn not by the shells themselves, but by the food gathering around them. From the surface, though, none of this was visible. The shells looked dull, gray, and lifeless. But when Dr. Shirley Krimsky and her team examined water samples and sediment cores in the lab, they found something completely different. What looked like dirt under the cameras was actually a thriving microscopic ecosystem. Without anyone realizing it, the first stage of the restoration was already complete, and somewhere in the Gulf, millions of drifting baby oysters were about to find their way home. The reef rebuilds itself. For years, Florida's oyster problem wasn't that there were no baby oysters. It was that they had nowhere to live. Every spawning season, a single adult oyster can release millions of eggs. They hatch into tiny larvae that drift with the Gulf currents for 2 to 3 weeks, searching for one thing, a hard surface where they can attach forever. And without it, they die. For decades, that was exactly what had been happening. Historic oyster reefs had been stripped away by overharvesting, storms, and pollution. The old shells that new generations depended on were gone, leaving only soft mud and shifting sand. So while millions of oyster larvae were still being produced every year, they had nowhere to settle. The shell reefs changed that almost overnight. Instead of drifting over an empty seafloor, countless larvae were carried into the cracks and gaps between the oyster shells. There, they found exactly what they had been searching for. The moment they attached to a shell, they cemented themselves in place for life and immediately began growing their own shells. This was exactly the breakthrough the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission had been hoping for. And to measure just how successful it was, Dr. Bill Pine and his team at the University of Florida monitored the reefs year after year. Divers counted live oysters, measured their growth, and compared the restored reefs with nearby areas that had received no shell restoration. And the results quickly exceeded every expectation. Within the first year, millions of young oysters had settled across the shell beds. By the second year, many had reached adulthood and were producing larvae of their own. That changed everything. The project was no longer relying on dumped shells. The reef had begun rebuilding itself. By the third year, researchers recorded an average of 847 live oysters per cubic meter on the restored reefs. And every oyster that died left behind another shell, creating the perfect home for the next generation. The reef wasn't just surviving anymore. It was expanding upward, spreading outward, and growing without any human help. But while scientists were still counting oysters and analyzing data, the people who worked these waters every day had already noticed something far bigger. The reef wasn't just bringing back oysters anymore. An ecosystem reborn. This time, the first people to notice the change weren't scientists. They were the fishermen. And one of them was Captain Mike Lenz, a veteran charter captain whose family had worked Florida's Gulf waters for generations. From the very beginning, he was one of the loudest critics of the project. He believed dumping oyster shells would ruin valuable fishing grounds. He spoke against the project at public meetings and warned it would do more harm than good. Then, in 2013, everything changed. While fishing over one of the restored reefs, Lenz watched schools of fish gathering beneath his boat in numbers he had never seen before. Looking at the water below, he admitted something he never expected to say. "I was wrong." Because this wasn't a graveyard anymore. It had become one of the richest fishing spots in the area. But his experience wasn't an isolated one. As researchers continued monitoring the reefs, they recorded something just as remarkable. Fish biomass, in other words, the total weight of fish living around the reefs, had increased by more than 340%. Species diversity rose by 240% compared with nearby areas. The numbers looked so unusual that researchers checked their calculations several times before publishing the results. They wanted to be sure they hadn't made a mistake. They hadn't. But what made these reefs truly different wasn't just the number of fish. It was where those fish came from. Most artificial reefs simply attract adult fish from nearby waters, gathering them in one place without increasing the overall population. These oyster reefs were doing something far more important. The maze of shells created safe hiding places for tiny fish and shrimp, while the growing reef provided an endless supply of food. More young fish survived, more reached adulthood, and the population began growing naturally. One species after another returned. Sheep's head arrived to feed on barnacles covering the shells. Flounder settled along the reef edges, waiting to ambush shrimp and crabs. Redfish and snook followed, using the reef to hunt. Soon, octopuses claimed their hidden spaces, sea turtles returned to feed, and even dolphins were seen hunting along the reef edges. The transformation became impossible to ignore. The same charter captains who had once fought the project were now asking for more reefs to be built. But as extraordinary as the return of marine life was, it wasn't the only sign of recovery. What scientists noticed next was a transformation that was slowly changing the Gulf itself. The filtration effect. The growing reef wasn't just bringing back marine life, it was changing the water itself. A single adult oyster can filter between 30 and 50 gallons of water every day. Using tiny hair-like structures on its gills, it continuously pulls in seawater, removes algae, mud, and other suspended particles, and then releases much cleaner water back into the Gulf. Now imagine that happening hundreds of thousands of times across the restored reefs. With an average of 847 oysters per cubic meter, scientists estimated the reefs were filtering billions of gallons of Gulf water every single day, all without electricity, pumps, or human maintenance. And Florida desperately needed that help. For years, fertilizers from farms, leaking septic systems, and urban runoff had been pouring excess nitrogen and phosphorus into coastal waters. Those nutrients fueled massive algae blooms that turned the water cloudy and blocked sunlight from reaching the seafloor. When those algae died, bacteria broke them down, using up huge amounts of oxygen in the process. Fish struggled to survive, and entire areas could become oxygen-poor dead zones. The oyster reefs quietly began reversing that process. By feeding on microscopic algae and removing suspended particles, they made the water noticeably clearer. Monitoring stations also recorded healthier oxygen levels around the restored reefs, even during the hottest months of the year. And that created another unexpected chain reaction. As more sunlight reached the bottom, seagrass began returning to places where it hadn't grown in years. Those underwater meadows locked loose sediment in place, keeping the water even clearer and allowing even more seagrass to spread. The reef wasn't working alone anymore. The oysters cleaned the water, the seagrass kept it clean, and together they created a better habitat for young fish, sea turtles, and even manatees. Researchers later estimated that the natural filtration, nutrient removal, and other ecological services provided by the restored reefs were worth tens of millions of dollars. And unlike a wastewater treatment plant, this one didn't need fuel, electricity, or repairs. It simply kept growing. By now, the project had exceeded almost every expectation. The fish had returned. The water was cleaner. The shoreline was recovering. But what came next wasn't another step in the recovery. It was the moment that would put everything to the test. One of the most destructive storms the Gulf had ever seen was on its way, and it would decide whether the entire experiment would survive or disappear forever. The storm test. On September 10, 2017, the answer arrived. Hurricane Irma, a Category 4 hurricane, slammed into Florida with winds exceeding 150 miles per hour. It was one of the strongest Atlantic hurricanes ever recorded. Along the Gulf Coast, a massive storm surge swept toward places like Cedar Key, carrying waves powerful enough to tear apart roads, destroy homes, and erase entire stretches of shoreline. As soon as the storm passed, engineers and researchers from the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission began surveying the damage. They compared coastlines protected by the restored oyster reefs with nearby shorelines that had no reefs at all. The difference was impossible to ignore. Where no reefs existed, waves tore away beaches and carved deep scars into the shoreline. But behind the restored reefs, the coast remained far more stable. Measurements later showed 30 to 40% less erosion than nearby unprotected areas. And the reason was surprisingly simple. The rough, uneven reef acted like a giant underwater barrier. Instead of allowing waves to hit the shore at full force, it broke their energy apart long before they reached land. Researchers estimated the reefs prevented about $3 million in property damage during Hurricane Irma alone. And by that point, the entire restoration program had cost roughly $5 million. In a single storm, the reefs had already returned much of their cost. But perhaps the most remarkable part was what happened after the storm. Concrete seawalls crack, weaken, and need costly repairs every time a major hurricane hits. Oyster reefs do the opposite. As oysters grow, they leave behind new shells that become the foundation for the next generation. Year after year, the reef becomes larger, thicker, and stronger. Instead of wearing out, it keeps rebuilding itself. The storm was over, but it had done something no scientific study ever could. It had tested the reefs under the worst possible conditions, and the results were unlike anything researchers had expected. Now, almost overnight, the experiment caught global attention, and from that moment on, this was no longer just Florida's story. From Florida to the world. What started as one risky experiment off the coast of Florida soon began spreading far beyond the state. By 2015, Alabama had expanded large-scale oyster reef restoration in Mobile Bay. Mississippi and Louisiana soon launched statewide shell recycling programs, using discarded oyster shells to rebuild damaged reefs and protect their coastlines. The idea even reached one of the busiest harbors in the world. In New York, the Billion Oyster Project adapted the same approach, using recycled shells to restore oyster reefs around Manhattan and help bring life back to New York Harbor. Researchers and coastal engineers from Canada, Australia, and several European countries also began studying the Cedar Key project. In 2023, American and Australian researchers even launched a joint project to develop self-repairing coastal defenses inspired by the same ideas that proved successful at Cedar Key. And while the rest of the world was learning from it, the original reefs were still growing. By the early 2020s, the oldest reef sites had roughly doubled in size without a single new load of shells being added. Each generation of oysters left behind the perfect foundation for the next, allowing the reefs to keep expanding on their own. Deep cracks and sheltered spaces formed between the shells, creating homes for crabs, octopuses, sea stars, and countless young fish. The reefs were also storing carbon inside their shells and surrounding sediments, while helping nearby waters resist the effects of ocean acidification. Today, some restored sites support nearly the same rich marine life as Florida's natural oyster reefs. So, here we are. What began in 2007 as a risky plan to dump discarded restaurant shells into the Gulf became one of the most successful coastal restoration projects in the world, and it's still growing. Now, what part of this story surprised you the most? And if restoring an entire ecosystem can begin with something as simple as a discarded oyster shell, what other solutions might we be throwing away every day? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up. And if you want more incredible science-backed transformation stories like this, be sure to subscribe to the channel. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.